Hello and welcome to I Was Just Wondering with me, Tom Salmon, the show that dives into music, film and games and everything else in between. My guest on this week's show is the movement artist, director and theatre designer, Ken Nakajima. Hello, Ken, and welcome to the show. So for people who aren't familiar with you and your work as an artist and director, who are you and what do you do?
Who am I? I'm Ken, movement artist, designer and director. I would say my practice would be called as visual dance theatre. Mm-hmm. So it's an incorporation of pretty self-explanatory visual arts, dance and theatre kind of combines into this symbiotic form.
Yes, yeah.
And so I kind of tend to like to explore the human condition through using mythology, psychology, and sort of autobiographical elements to kind of infuse that into the body and into the space.
Right. Okay, cool. So before we jump into all that, my first topic is identity. So I want to start off by asking you a day zero question. Can you remember the first time you entered the flow state, the zone, when you danced as a child?
Yes, probably a few months into doing hip hop,
right?
Because that's kind of where I started my dance journey.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was a moment where your body is growing accustomed to the style of movement.
Yeah.
And so you feel like you're becoming much more comfortable with it. And in that moment, you kind of start to kind of appreciate what you're doing,
right?
What everyone's doing. You start to really enjoy it. And I think once I entered that state of just kind of executing a choreography for the first time, I was like, what, 5?
Right. Yeah.
It was a very euphoric experience. And that sort of experience kind of comes to me every time I perform or every time I present a piece of work where it's sort of out of body.
Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah.
You kind of lose one part of yourself and this other part of you just kind of completely possesses your body.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really fun, but also kind of disturbing at the same time. Because once you're out of the space, you're like, oh, what just happened?
Mm-hmm.
And I always really kind of enjoy that.
Yeah. So hip hop is interesting. So what kind of hip hop music were you dancing to, and what was your particular style of hip hop? Because it's very broad church.
I would say what they taught me was very, very traditional,
right?
Hip hop. So even the music was like from the 90s, A Tribe Called Quest,
okay,
Far Side,
yeah.
The older Black Eyed Peas, probably before Fergie Black Eyed Peas,
yeah.
Which I think is better.
Yeah,
but that's one man's opinion.
Okay, cool. So at 5, like, how did your parents just sort of take you along to the dance studio and that kind of thing, or?
I think everyone says this. I saw like Michael Jackson.
Okay, right, yeah.
Controversially, Chris Brown.
Okay, yes, yeah. Well, like there was a point where Chris Brown was somewhat respectable, and then like not. So
yeah, and because I think I saw him I can't remember which song it was, just like a music video on MTV or something.
Yeah.
And just seeing these guys dance, I was just like, I want to do that. And my parents were like, okay,
nice.
Let's give it a go. And then that was it.
Yeah. Okay, so just sort of moving on from that. So you were born and raised in Japan. So it's kind of like a place that sort of as certain parts of Japan are kind of seen as a sci-fi melting pot of very different sort of like cultural influences. So can you think of a sort of a culture clash of new meeting old, which had a profound effect on you around that sort of time?
Yes, it was yes and no, I think, in terms of a cultural clash, because yes, Japan is very traditional, very conservative as a culture. But at the same time, throughout history, there's always been a counter movement to that, to sort of kind of relieve themselves of the pressure of being in such a rigid society. Even, for example, the 17th century kabuki, for example.
Yeah.
That was a counter movement to the really rigid and very traditional formats of theatre and performance and the culture. And then, of course, you kind of jump to now. There's all of these subcultures and even on TV media, reality shows like the comedy, for example, it's so extravagant and so over the top. And same with the subcultures. I think it's just a way for young people to express that frustration and trying to feel like they kind of want to come out of this conformity of society. So I think growing up, being exposed to that constantly, and I think most Japanese people can say this, that you're kind of used to it.
Yeah.
That it's like, yes, we're told to live in this certain way, but also there's a way for us to kind of relieve that frustration.
Yeah.
And I think that definitely applies to other cultures as well.
So I just kind of want to circle back a little bit, because historically speaking, there has been like quite a large American influence on Japan, because obviously they rebuilt it after the Second World War. So a lot of GIs that came over there basically transplanted a lot of American culture that then was taken up by Japanese people, generally speaking. I'm not an expert by any means. And then that goes back to the idea of like hip hop, and how like you have like hip hop, like Japanese sort of hip hop, which takes from obviously American hip hop, but does it in its own very particular way. And I just wondered, in terms of through that sort of cultural prism of experiencing sort of, I guess, like traditional American culture, but done in a Japanese way, is there anything you could sort of point to where you can see something that was taken from, say, like America per se, but then reinterpreted in a sort of Japanese kind of way?
There's like a whole like motorcycle gang
thing
going on.
Yeah.
But also there's very problematic elements of like, there's a certain subculture where they really use a lot of fake tan.
Right, okay,
to darken their skin. But I read this briefly that it was just because they thought like black Americans were really cool.
Oh, interesting. I've never heard of this before.
Yeah, and that's their only kind of legitimate point, which is...
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think that's quite common in East Asia, where they would take a lot of influence from like black American culture, reinterpret it, appropriate it, and kind of make it their own and not really justify it.
Okay.
And I think that's been a huge issue.
Okay.
For the last however many decades, like even in K-pop, for example. K-pop would be nothing without hip-hop.
That is interesting. Yeah, there's a lot of borrowing, should we say? But I guess like it's sort of interesting, because in terms of like culture, exporting a certain like culture, and saying like, okay, well, this is what we've kind of done with it, let's see what you can kind of do with it, and then getting to a place where like, we can authentically take something and then kind of make it our own, and it's kind of okay, like it's not really like appropriation, it's more like, we've just decided to take like a left turn or a right turn. And I'm sure there is stuff that kind of exists like that, but I can't really, off the top of my head, I can't really think of anything. All I can think of is just the very Americanized Japanese sort of hip hop that I've sort of vaguely come into contact with. So just moving on. So growing up, and this follows on from the last question, we tend to have a few pop cultural heroes, like actors, musicians, and writers, which tend to change as our tastes develop. So who was your most embarrassing one, and who was your most respected cultural hero in your adolescence?
I don't know if it's embarrassing, but I would say growing up, here during like 2011, 2012 onwards, when Tumblr came. Okay. That was a huge impact on like the youth. So like, for example, like in 1975.
Oh yeah.
I just thought when I was like 13, 14, I'd say even up to like 16, I just thought Matt Healy was such a really cool guy. And like the whole aesthetic of that, really like, we're all kind of making ourselves depressed. Yeah. And I mean, we were.
Yeah, you're at that age. Yeah,
we were. Yeah. But, that sort of aesthetic of just being like, ugh. Yeah. Oh, I hate life. Oh, it's so hard to be young, which is, I think. I think there was some valid points in that culture. But looking back now, I'm just like, it was a little bit cringe. Yeah. Just a little bit. But it's funny that it's kind of coming back. So like even far as back as like Indie Sleaze. It's coming back.
It is coming back, yeah.
And jeans are getting skinnier again.
They are getting skinnier again, yeah.
Which I don't know if I like, but I mean, it's up to their own, I guess. Yeah. But it's interesting that it's all kind of circling back again.
Yeah, well, there's always like these 20-year periods where culture, like say 20 years ago, because I'm old, so I remember it. Like I remember it the first time round, to the skinny jeans and like the Hoxton, the Hoxton haircuts, and yeah, the indie music. I wasn't terribly into it at the time. I was much a bigger fan of like electronic music, but it's always the same way. So back, I'm trying to think when I was young. What were they kind of looking back? I guess it would have been more like 80s, like the Cure, that kind of sort of like stuff. I guess like Nirvana, because I really wasn't really around for that either. But it's but it is interesting. Generationally speaking, each younger generation looks 20 years back in the past, which actually isn't that far back. It's quite close. And one of the things I think about this is because we've got the internet. Like you can, like nobody has to be out of touch. You can just like Google something. You can, I guess it's just whether you want to do that.
Yeah.
So was Matt Healy your most respected, most embarrassing?
I think a mixture at that time.
Okay.
Of course, there's other people who are kind of more respectable that I admired at the time. But I think with Matt Healy, he was sort of. He acted as sort of like a counter of what a man should be,
right?
In a way, because he's quite feminine. He's really comfortable with his masculinity.
Yeah.
And I think at that age, being a boy, it was such a relief because I feel like because I went to 2 secondary schools. When I moved here, and the first one was very conformative, very traditional. Boys do this, girls do that, and boys do what boys do. They take a lot from each other.
Yeah.
And they kind of they suppress a lot, and like they just need to feel like they're like the it. And then that was really frustrating for me growing up because I'm not the most masculine of the masculine. And then so when people like Matt Healy came along, or just other people throughout that Tumblr era, or even before the Indie Sleaze era, I was just like, I'm like, okay, that's acceptable. I can be a bit more relaxed. I don't have to like dress in a certain way to feel like a man or to feel more masculine. I can relax. But then at the same time, hip hop was still a thing within me. So, and I feel like certain parts of the hip hop culture is very hyper masculine. And it's they kind of ignore certain aspects of hip hop that are a bit more feminine, but also the people that were involved in hip hop. So I feel like there's this. I found it a little bit restrictive in that sense. Obviously, I was in a hip hop crew. As well.
Okay, what was your hip hop crew name?
Oh god. It wasn't me, by the way, who titled it or gave the name. I think it was called The Force.
Okay, The Force. Yeah. Okay, yeah, nice. Yeah.
And it was mostly boys. Everyone from everywhere. All across London. But it was a very quite a hyper masculine.
Okay.
Kind of crew. Yeah, there were girls as well.
Yeah.
But I think it was a very we're here to show up.
Right.
So I was kind of battling that, but at the same time, I was a bit soft as well. Do you know what I mean? I was just I loved opera.
Right.
Classical music. I love my jazz.
Right.
Musical theatre every now and then. Theatre boy. But also being part of the hip hop culture, but also being part of this.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So I was in such a weird, contradictory place. Like even my fashion.
Okay.
It didn't make sense.
Right.
Up until 2019, I would say.
Okay. Which brings me nicely onto, because you've spoken through your work deals with sort of sense of identity crisis. So I want to take a moment here to examine the concept of identity crisis in relation, as you've sort of spoken about, to your peer group and surroundings. So I guess just following on from that, let's start at the very sort of specific point where you started questioning your place in the world, because I think you mentioned you are of mixed heritage, are you not?
Probably the first time I questioned it was probably 5.
Yeah.
I would say. Because when I joined elementary school in Japan, I didn't realize that's when I kind of was first exposed to xenophobia.
Right.
I didn't realize how conservative people were.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah.
And then sort of being called out or being pointed out for certain things, being treated in a certain way that wasn't equal to others, and that's a very large issue in Japan. In Japan, if you're mixed Japanese, if you're from another East Asian country, or if you have a darker complexion, you're treated as a sort of like an abnormality. They won't admit it, but it's very common.
Okay.
I've heard it's getting better now.
Yeah.
But I think being exposed to that throughout my schooling in Japan, it was really hard for me to call Japan home. and, you know, visiting the UK as well. So at the time I had 2 homes, but then once that started happening, I found it really hard to kind of have 2 places where I could call home. So I think I was slowly detaching from Japan, even from that age, and just feeling very alone.
Right.
And I remember I had like a bit of a dramatic moment as a kid, just being like, do you know what? I'm just going to do this on my own. I'm just going to take on the world on my own.
Yeah.
And that's that. And I think that's definitely caused some issues growing up, I think, of just kind of this sense of longing for a community and just feeling accepted. And I still kind of struggle with that.
Yeah.
In terms of like building relationships. And I still feel like I'm searching for a community.
Right.
Where I don't feel like I have to be pointed out.
Yeah. And that's interesting because there was a bit of a furore when very recently when I believe I think it was a lady in waiting asked somebody who was working, you know, where are you from? Where are you really from? Kind of like question. And I was just like, yeah, it's really insulting to be asked that and to be pressed into sort of corner, but also to be able to ask that question and be able to share somebody's sort of like split heritage and what they're in a sort of celebratory sort of like way of like, okay, you're from this is what you do, this is what I've sort of like encountered, in a way that doesn't seem sort of combative or sort of called out in a way, because I think like in terms of like cultural exchange and our cultural like I don't really like the word sort of education, but in terms of being able to think through other people's experiences to broaden our own experiences, I think that's sort of important. So in terms of you, was it your mother or your father that was like Japanese, and what was this sort of like polarity where you were moving between the 2 places?
So my dad's Japanese, and my mum's Scottish.
Oh, okay, right.
And yeah, even growing up, even the household was fine. I think both of them had lived in different places. Right. They had travelled. Yeah. Especially my mum. So they've always had a very relaxed point of view on what tradition and what culture is. And I think being exposed to Western culture at the same time, I just didn't feel like I had to fit in a certain category. Yeah. Even though I felt like it. So that's another thing as well. I think being in school in Japan, it's like I would have all these different references of music. Right. And artists. And of course at the time doing opera. Yeah. In Tokyo. You know, I'm taking all these different information, talking to these different people from all these countries. So for me, like a very international sense of, I don't know, exposure. Was always there throughout my life. So I never felt like when I moved to the UK, felt like I had to readjust in a certain way.
Right.
Because I was just kind of sort of used to that, I guess, diversity or just having different people around me. So it just felt more natural. And of course, even though the UK has its problems, but I think in a sense of different communities, that is more evident here than I've seen in Japan, if that makes sense.
It does, because I was thinking about like the Windrush generation, which was a follow-on to how like the specials got started in the late 70s. Unfortunately, Terrett Hall, the lead singer of the specials, recently passed away, but I went through a rabbit hole of figuring out, well, how did this come to be? Like, how did like this multicultural band come to be? And it's through that integration of people coming over to work into these sort of communities, and then they realized at a certain point they had more in common than they didn't, essentially, for where they were sort of like working, and those bonds are formed. And I just wonder, and again, like my knowledge of history is not particularly great here, but I wonder with like Japan, other than when the GIs were coming over to sort of rebuild and then like left, there hasn't maybe been such a great level of that cultural exchange of people actually specifically en masse moving to Japan to find work. So I guess that's just not something they really that I can sort of like think of as whereas yes, as the UK has problems, but we have had a history of countries from the Commonwealth coming over here and working and integrating, and that has created like a nice sort of like melting pot of cultural exchange. Which in a way I think it enriches communities and enriches people's horizons, but then you also get into that nasty thing of like, oh no, it's bit, you know, in certain quarters it can be seen as sort of appropriation if it's done for the wrong things, or it can be like the specials where they were fusing like punk and like Jamaican music together and then creating something entirely new, which was authentic to where they were at. Just sort of like thinking about this as well in terms of your sort of Japanese heritage. What are some of the things that you sort of cherish about that, and what are the sort of things here, sort of a more Western like that you kind of think? What are the two things you like about these two very different opposite things?
I think I do cherish that I'm very disciplined and very structured as a person.
Yeah,
that's a very Japanese thing,
right?
So I think generally I can say that Japanese people are very efficient people,
right?
Yeah, and I take pride in that. So for me, that kind of spilt into the way I live my life, or even in the way I make. Everything's quite polished. It's clean.
Yeah,
it's simple. I'm not trying to go over the top.
Yeah,
it's like, well, this is it. This is what I want to show, and that's it. And I do appreciate that. And then here, I'd say, let me think. I think the banter.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
I've always enjoyed like the humor here, and even when I first moved here, I just thought it was really funny that people kind of self-deprecated themselves as a form of humor.
Yeah.
Which I really appreciate, and the sarcasm, I think.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't thought about like. I don't want to say what I appreciate in this country.
Yeah. So finally, just moving on from that question, and we kind of covered it a little bit, but how do you feel your creative identity has developed over the years, starting from early childhood when you were performing in theatres and operas in Tokyo, and we'll jump into that actually now a little bit more, to becoming a freelance creative professional, like a director and choreographer in London. So tell me a little bit more about working in opera in Tokyo.
So that was through the same place where I was doing hip hop. It was sort of like an agency as well.
Okay.
So there was an opening for Madame Butterfly at the New National Theatre in Tokyo. And then obviously I just auditioned.
Yeah.
And I got it. And then for me, I think being at that age, I didn't really take notice of the scale and the amount of money that goes into making these like major league operas and productions.
Yeah.
So I was fortunate enough to work with them and do like 2 operas per year for like almost 6 years.
Yeah.
So for me, it was like a regular thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I'd be taken out of school during the summer.
Yeah.
And so for me, it was just like a really fun experience.
Yeah.
And then just kind of being part of that culture as well. And I think being exposed to certain things that I may have forgotten, but still very much so an influence throughout my creative journey.
Yeah.
I feel like in a way that I'm kind of circling back to the opera.
Yeah.
Because I do want to direct opera at some point.
Okay, yeah.
Not as like the main thing.
Yeah.
But just sort of to give an homage to my younger self in a way of being like, yeah, this look how far you've come. Like you were performing then and now you're directing it.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was a very special time, I think. And I don't think I would be where I am in terms of the way I see without that opera experience,
Right.
I don't think.
Okay. I imagine it's quite intense though, because you're actually working on professional productions and stuff. So I can imagine, there's some sort of professionalness to it, and also working with professional actors. So how was that at a very young age?
I didn't really care.
Right.
And I've always been that way, where I'm just like, I don't really take notice to that sense of superiority.
Okay.
So for me, it was just like, great, I'm here to work, you're here to work. Let's have a bit of fun
Okay.
and see how it goes.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think at some points it was intimidating.
Yeah.
Just to see like these world-class musicians and singers and directors come through. And for me, I think I got that feeling of like intimidation, I think years after, like looking back on like programs and like being like, who sang for who was the conductor then, and I'm just now looking back and being like, oh my God.
Yeah.
I worked with them
Yeah.
and I can't remember some of their faces.
Mm.
And so I think that gave me like a more profound sense of appreciation at what I did.
Yeah.
Because I think before I was just like, oh, it's just a thing I did as a kid.
Yeah.
And then, you know, even my parents or people would be like, what do you mean? It's just a thing that you did. You know how big that is.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, but you know, we move on.
Yeah.
You know?
It's only after the fact. So I just want to jump into topic 2, which is dance and education. So I want to jump a little bit more into the world of street dancing. So you represented the United Kingdom twice at the UDO World Street Dance Championships. So how did you get started and eventually qualify for that competition?
So when I moved schools to Elstree Academy,
Yeah.
At the time they brought on a new tutor who happened to be a dancer and choreographer who had worked with young people, and he sort of kind of wanted to form a crew.
Right.
And
Was this the Force?
yes, that was the Force. And it was really exciting for me, especially because, you know, moving from Japan and then for a few years living in the UK, I kind of had to stop certain things that I would have done just because I couldn't read or write in English when I moved here.
Right.
And so I just kind of focused on education as the main thing.
Yeah.
Even at that age, I was just like, yeah, I want to do fun things, but I need to be able to kind of adjust that I can actually communicate with people. And
Right,
I actually
yeah.
can do things I want to do. But let me just focus on my education first. So for me, I hadn't done hip hop in like a few years.
Yeah.
And then when this came up, I was just like, oh my God, like I can do this and still continue with my studies or whatever. Because I like studying. And yeah, I remember the first audition. It was really funny. I didn't know what I was doing.
Yeah.
Just waggling my arms around.
It was like freestyling.
Yeah, just freestyling.
Yeah.
Like a style of hip hop that was like not outdated.
Oh, interesting. Right. Yeah.
But of course, you know, street dance at the time, it was another style of form that was coming in from America again. So now it used to be called urban style choreography. Now it's open style choreography.
Right.
So coming from like the East and Southeast Asian Americans, the Black Americans, they created this very amazing style. So that was coming in.
Yeah.
And then, so I was kind of watching that on YouTube at the same time.
Right.
And then when I saw that they were doing a crew, I was just like, oh, dude,
Yeah.
I've got to join.
Yeah.
And then we started to compete in regional championships and we were doing really well. Like, you know, top 3 every time.
Nice.
And then we qualified for the Worlds and it was in Glasgow.
Okay. Right.
And I thought that was amazing because at the time I watched this really bad film, dance film. I can't remember what was it called. I don't know. Anyway,
Was it the British version of like Step Up? Because I think it's called like Street Dance 3D.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Street dance. And there was another B-boy film that was sort of like, kind of about like the World Championships.
Oh, right. Okay.
I can't remember what it was called.
Yeah.
But I was sort of inspired by that. I'm like, oh my God, like I get to kind of live this fantasy of going to a competition.
Yeah.
And it was huge. I mean, it was, every country was there. Even Japan was there.
Yeah.
And I got to speak to them, which was really nice.
Yeah.
But of course, Japan, you know, they won it. And of course, the Germans won it as well. But even getting into top 10,
Yeah.
for us, that was just an amazing experience. And yeah, it was really nice. I think it was the first time that I felt that sense of like belonging. I'm
You're
like,
right.
like, this is my team. These are my guys. Because that's how it was during school as well. Like you knew who to go to
Yeah.
and you sat together and it was really nice to have that sense of community.
Right.
So I really enjoyed that period of time and it was a very influential time, I think.
And one of the things I was watching the street dance competitions of 2019, because I guess that's just right before that COVID hit, so I could watch. So I was watching like a battle of like under 16s, I think. And the thing that was interesting to me is like male dancers and female dancers could actually like battle each other. There wasn't this sort of thing. Like, and I was thinking in terms of like sports and men and women competing together, like dance actually pretty is like a level like playing field, depending what sort of, you know, if you're popping and locking, like it doesn't matter if you're male or female, you know, if your locks are like hitting hard.
Don't matter.
It doesn't matter. Exactly, yeah. And I did watch this young Japanese lady battle this guy, and yeah, she just like destroyed him. It was just, it was insane, actually insane. Yeah. So just moving from the world of like competitive sort of street dancing, that sort of stuff. As you say, which can be seen as like in terms of your routine, you can build your routines, and the language, I guess, is like created in a less, I don't want to say it a less formal way, but it's, I guess like it's not as rigidly sort of like structured as say formal dance training. So I just want to jump back to 2015 where you studied at the Eel Street Stream Arts Academy, where you trained in dance, drama and music. And I'd like to know for you, what were the benefits and limitations of formally studying dance in that regard?
For me, it was sort of refreshing to put down on paper and learn theory of dance.
Okay.
I thought that was interesting. I did struggle because there's a lot of theory and there's a lot of learning about how the body and how the joints work. So like you're kind of taught how to write choreography.
Wow. Okay. Interesting.
And you sort of have to like inquire which parts of the bodies you're moving with this type of movement.
Right.
And learning all the muscle joints. And then that was a bit overwhelming for me. But of course it kind of helped me along the way. But at the time I was just like, why am I doing this? Just let me dance.
So how do you, is like writing choreography like writing a music score? Like how do you actually write a piece of choreography out on a piece of paper? Is it symbols or do you?
There's so many different ways of kind of writing down choreography. For example, like Laban.
Okay.
Was a guy who kind of came up with his own kind of style, ethos, and kind of culture around it. And it kind of involved mathematics, and like he would draw these weird patterns and like where to stand, where to go, talking about how much you can extend your arm to kind of execute this movement.
Yeah.
It's about the kinesphere, how everyone has sort of this sphere of space where we can interact with it. Trisha Brown, she created sort of a format where you can, it's called Trisha Brown's Cube.
Okay.
And basically you kind of label, you imagine that you're in a cube, or if you're in a space, you look at all the four corners and you kind of label them A to Z.
Yeah.
And then you sort of kind of spell out your name.
Okay.
And then you can kind of create a choreography out of that. Or you can just simply write down what you see, write down what you're doing as best as you can.
Yeah.
And for me, that was really interesting, but very helpful at the same time. But of course, at the time, dance education in the UK is contemporary dance, which is something that I'd never done before. So that was another moment of kind of readjusting my body into this much more fluid and much more elegant form of dance.
Right.
And I found that to be sort of like another trigger where I was like, oh, actually, I really like dancing this way. I find there's a sense of relief, and I don't feel like having to be so combative all the time. I'm being ready to like battle someone.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
Because I think competitive dance, you're kind of built to compete.
Yeah.
Whereas I found contemporary dance, doing those classes, I just found it really nice to kind of move different parts of my body, and kind of exploring that. So for example, a lot of the influences that I have now, like Akram Khan, who was a huge influence for me at the time, watching his show 0 Degrees. And that was another moment where I was like, oh, you can do that in dance?
Yeah.
And then, so for me, I'm very glad that I took those classes.
Right.
And I took it, and I just want to like, thank my tutor, James Golds, who was just an amazing teacher and dancer. And yeah, I'm grateful.
So up until this point, it's just been sort of dance focused from what I understand. And then I understand that your creative identity and focus shift from being a dancer to a visual artist and theatre practitioner back in 2017 when you attended Middlesex University's BA Theatre Arts degree. So can you tell me the tipping point which changed your creative journey around that time?
I would say the tipping point was when I was probably deciding where to go for university. Because I was thinking, do I just focus on one skill?
Yeah.
Or try and adapt and use my other skills as well? Because at the same time, I love my drama and I loved production tech as well, because that's something that I took as a B-Tech by accident.
Right.
I didn't want to take it.
Yeah.
But I had to take it because it was either that or something else that I didn't want to do. And then I just kind of fell in love with learning what goes behind and beyond the performance. And I found like a really deep, profound appreciation for that. And I kind of wanted to inquire that further. So it was all these factors kind of merging into one, but definitely not going to dance school was painful as a decision. And I still feel like a really small part of me regrets that.
Right.
Even though I shouldn't, because I wouldn't have had this realization or this tipping point of where I am now.
Yeah.
Without making that decision. So I'm kind of grateful for myself for doing that. But at the same time, there is that sense of longing to be part of the dance world again.
And like being a dancer is like not easy. Just being part of an ensemble, like there's an insane amount of work that you have to do, and there's an insane amount of punishment that you put on your body. It actually reminds me a little bit, a few years ago I actually watched the movie, I forget the guy's name, but it's basically called The White Crow, which is basically about this Russian dancer that ended up defecting at the end of the movie to like America.
Yeah.
So you just sort of see like we see that guy sort of like journey and I guess like the conflict, and then his love of like dance and everything else that goes along with that. And knowing a few dancers in my time as well, like it takes a very special human being to say like, I just want to be part of this ensemble and I will dance as long as my body is able to like dance. Because it's funny, I mentioned it just we were speaking before about seeing the Maurice Cunningham documentary, and one of his quotes he said is that you're training an instrument that deteriorates from like birth, which is just such an interesting way of like looking at it, that you're literally fighting against yourself. I guess because throughout time you can improve your form and your function, but I guess on a cellular level you are deteriorating. So was there anything about that to you that in terms of like just almost applying this sort of like monk-like part of your career, probably maybe would like, I don't know how long professional dancers' careers last. Is that sort of like 20 years or something like that? Not even?
You could push it to 30.
Okay.
Just about.
Yeah. So was there a factor, was that anything running through your mind of like, am I going to be able to sort of physically be able to commit that length of time to just purely be a dancer?
No. I think people were telling me that. But I wasn't listening because I've always had sort of this delusion of myself where I'm just like, no, I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
I'm going to do it as long as I can. I don't care when it ends, but I will do it if I have to.
Yeah.
And so that idea of kind of suffering, it's cliche, but kind of idea of suffering for your work.
Yeah.
I've always kind of accepted as a part of becoming an artist.
Yeah.
Cliche.
Yeah.
But I think there's some truth in it. So for me, I wasn't thinking about that at all.
Okay.
It was just, for me, it was losing, the fear of losing that expression.
Right, I see. Yeah.
Because I felt like dance, for me, was a very strong, and it still is, a form of expression and kind of releasing tension. And I think it's one of the most powerful ways of expressing emotion without even realizing.
So just alongside your higher education experience at that time, were you going to cultural institutions, if I can even say the word, like the V&A, the Place, Tate Modern, to broaden your creative horizons as well outside of the more formal stuff that you're doing?
Yeah, always. Do you know what? I have never been to the V&A.
Oh, okay.
Ever. Which is weird.
Yeah, still time.
Yeah, I've still got time. I might put that onto my checklist for 2023. Go to the V&A. But places like the Barbican as well, National Theatre, Sadler Wells. I would go to all of these places, even from a young age. But I think the most place that I've been to was probably the Tate Modern.
Okay, yeah.
It was like the first kind of contemporary gallery that I went to when I first moved here.
Yeah.
And it's always been a sense of peacefulness whenever I go there.
Yeah.
I've been there so many times, but I still get lost. So there's always that sense of childhood wonder. And I'd love to do something there at some point. I don't know.
Was there any particular art that you saw there that had a particular effect on you? Any other artist you can sort of call out or installation that you saw?
Pierre Soulages.
Okay.
He's a very brilliant abstract painter who kind of uses black.
Okay. Yeah.
Forefront.
Yeah.
He's sort of known as the master of black. And when I saw his painting the first time, I was moved quite a bit.
Yeah.
Tremendously. And then I kind of forgotten about him.
Yeah.
And then it was only recently that I came across it again and kind of did a deep dive into what he does, and that really inspired me to do this sort of diagram of sort of like an artistic family lineage. So I would kind of put myself in the middle, and then I would put all the people that inspire me and who inspired him and their predecessors.
Right, interesting, yeah.
And I realized that everyone is somehow linked to one another. And so for me, looking at his painting a few months ago again at the Tate was sort of, it felt like I was kind of reuniting with like a lost family member. And I got really emotional.
Nice.
I didn't cry my eyes out in front of everyone in the Tate, but I felt like it.
Yeah, well, it's nice when you have this sort of cathartic or, like, and maybe cathartic isn't the right experience, but when you have like a real like connection with a piece of art that really sort of like touches you, because sometimes it can kind of feel kind of rare. So just like after 4 years of higher education and internships and the onset of a global pandemic, why did you choose to study at Central St. Martin's and take the MA in Performance Design and Practice?
Because I sort of had a point during my BA where I kind of started to realize what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
So I kind of birthed this essence of this thing that I wanted to create, but I didn't know what it was. I couldn't quite translate that into a creative language yet.
Yeah.
And so I kind of wanted a place where I could experiment without judgment, bias, and just see what happens. And I thought, and always thought that CSM was sort of kind of that place to do that, and just kind of seeing CSM kids every now and then, walking past King's Cross, and they're all crazy. But I just always thought, that's kind of my crazy.
Yeah.
And I got in.
Would you kind of say, because as we've sort of been speaking throughout this sort of interview, would you say that that's a particular point? It's like a combination of putting in like the dance, the theatre, like basically up until that point, all the things you sort of had kind of done that you could essentially focus that in one particular kind of like place. So you could experiment with all those things like all at once. Whereas if you were just doing one of them, you wouldn't be able to have a sort of free range to be able to put all that sort of stuff together. So was that something that was sort of, again, like?
I think so, because I think I sort of had a trigger moment when I did my final degree show in my BA. I did this dance theatre piece, even though the directing module itself was to direct a play.
Yeah.
And so I kind of fought to direct my own devised play, even though it wasn't really a play. It was definitely a dance. So, I worked with these two brilliant Portuguese dancers, and very simple, white space, one chair, and just two performers. And that was a point where I was like, okay, I've done what I'm trying to explore, but how can I make this better?
Right.
I don't know enough. That was hard to admit. At the time, because when you're in uni, you've done a few years, you're like, I know my shit. And then when I got to that point after doing that show, I was like, actually, I don't know anything. I was like, I've only learned specifics. And then so I thought it'd be best to apply. And then it was weird that's when the pandemic hit as well. That was strange. For me, that was horrible, but at the same time, it gave me a solid year of just kind of teaching myself and just exposing myself to different practitioners, artists, and performances. So luckily a lot of places, theatres, they did a lot of online shows. And I kind of watched all the European ones. And so for example, Schaubühne Berlin, every week they would do like 10 shows online.
Right.
And it'd be all scheduled.
And
And it was all free. So I'd watch, 3 or 4 a day, taking notes and just kind of looking into who are these directors, who are these performers, and just kind of buying books as well. And just, so that was a huge study period. So I felt like I studied for 4 years straight.
Right.
Before I even started my master's. So for me, when I started at CSM, I knew what I wanted to do.
Right.
And I knew what I wanted to explore, and I had already projects in mind that I wanted to present. And so I kind of came up with this plan that I would kind of complete this trilogy that I started from my final grad show at the BA. So that was Sempre, and then 2021 I did La Noia, and then in May 2022 I did Archipelago. So that was sort of like a trilogy that I did for myself.
Right.
It was a bit ambitious,
Yeah. Well, why not? Yeah.
but I did it.
Yeah.
So I'm very glad. Yeah.
So just moving on to topic 3, and into if I ever get around to living.
Yeah.
Was that your final piece for the MA?
It was one of them.
Okay.
So I remember having a discussion with some of the tutors, and they were like, so what are you presenting as your final thing? And I was like, I'm presenting 2.
Mm-hmm.
They were like, what? 2?
Okay.
Why would you do that? I'm just like, because I want to give it a go.
Mm.
And if I ever get around to living was probably the most impulsive and most kind of, it came from from a really deep place of just seeing what happens.
Yeah.
So I just felt like I had to make it, even though I had barely any references,
Okay.
barely any research.
Yeah.
I just felt like I had to do this performance because it all kind of came to me in one go.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, like the way I create is like I see images in my head and I just have to join them together.
Mm-hmm.
So for that show particularly, all 6 sections came to me back to back.
Okay.
And it started from a video that I did in 2020 of me kind of just falling into the wall in my room.
Yeah, yeah.
I filmed that, completely forgot about it, found it on my phone, and then I was like, oh, let me see what I can do with that.
Mm-hmm.
And then I took it to the studio, tried it with it about for 10 minutes,
Mm.
and then I was like, okay, I think I can turn this into a show. So I just got 6 people that I just knew from the calls, or just kind of judged it by face value. I was just like, oh, you would look cool in a performance.
Yeah.
That's kind of how I work. I'm just like, I'll just bring on people by random.
So for people who are listening, and you can check it out on YouTube, I'll put a link underneath. What is If I Ever Get Around to Living about? How would you describe it to somebody who's never seen it before?
This is one of the things, right? Because it was so impulsive. But I would say it's sort of a demonstration of kind of dealing with the past and trying to acknowledge something, not letting go of it.
Yeah.
But just acknowledging something in your past and trying to move on with your life.
Yeah.
Because it was at a point when I created this, I just felt very stuck.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to kind of release myself somehow.
Yeah.
So throughout the performance, these 6 performers are trying to look for something on the wall. They're trying to go through the wall. You can't go through a wall.
Yeah.
So the whole point is that sometimes you kind of stop yourself from moving forwards, and there's nothing else that's holding you back in a certain way.
Yeah.
And you can leave if you want. But also it's kind of trying to look back on what was important and what was the problem, and trying to kind of deal with it in a certain way. It's very vague because, it was one of those ideas where I just wanted to try it.
Yeah.
But it's definitely that element of letting go of something.
Yeah.
That's very important.
So just getting to sort of specifics a little bit, in terms of how it starts, there's a door that opens and then one of the performers sort of enters, and then after a period of time, more and more performers sort of like build up, and then they go towards the wall. So one of the interesting things, when I sort of studied like movement and that kind of thing, is like taking stage, but also the first moment when you actually enter the stage and your particular presence. So do you have any particular feeling about that, or what was the kind of like atmosphere that you were trying to create in that initial moment to get people's attention?
I think for me, it was to explore how much I could play with silence.
Okay.
And how the most simple actions and simple things could create a lot of noise, and how our attention could be directed towards that. So, because originally the performance was meant to have music with it that I made really badly.
Oh, you made the music yourself?
Yeah.
Oh,
so
nice.
I just kind of remixed like this Gregorian chant and just like chopped it up and made it really kind of ethereal. It was okay. Not bad. But it was literally the night before the performance where we sort of had a final rehearsal. We did it with the music. And then once that was finished, I was like, guys, I'm cutting the music.
Yeah.
And they're like, really? But why? And I was just like, it just doesn't feel right. And this is probably the only time where I'm going to sound authoritative as a director. Like, I'm cutting it. That's it.
Yeah.
Bit weird doing that because I'm not usually like that. But I was just like, guys, I just have to get it out of the way. So, and I think it made the performance 10 times more powerful.
Yeah.
Because you could hear all the little noises.
Yeah, so there's an interesting thing when I was watching this Cunningham documentary about Marie. I forget what his name is, but it's Marie. I don't know. Dyslexia again. But what was interesting about that and what I would draw a parallel to is the fact that when he was doing his performances, he did work with like John Cage and there's a lot of abstract music and he was sort of working against it. He didn't believe that music should accompany the music. The two things should kind of be an opposite and create something else. But when he wasn't playing with that sort of musicality to his work, if you just listen in silence, that the basically people's bare feet on a stage sounds like paintbrush strokes. And essentially what I was thinking in a sort of abstract way, the fact the movement is like building up material, it's building up sort of movement, physical sort of like paint that you're sort of like playing with. And there is something very nice about silence, but just the idea of a bare foot on a stage and people moving around. Yeah. It's very primal. So in regards to the more sort of technical specifics of like in terms of like lines of movement, because that's a very key thing in dance of where you stage left, stage right, where you draw the focus. And going back to Cunningham, he didn't believe in having sort of center stage. He would have like performances happening on the very like far right or the very far left. So in terms of your creative choices and the planes that you wanted to work with, how did that sort of like come about? And also just going back to earlier, were you noting the choreography before for your performers so they could like read it or whatever?
It was actually through sketches.
Okay.
And I do this a lot recently with my performances where when I come up with it, because it comes as an image, I'll have to draw it out. And then most of the time throughout that process, it was me showing the performers. I'm like, can you do this?
Yeah.
It's really bad drawing, but can you do that? Let's give it a go.
Yeah.
And that's how it was throughout the whole process of just kind of deconstructing the image. And how we can bring it to life.
Yeah.
But I'm also very, very inspired by paintings.
Yeah.
And the composition. So it's this little subtle details of kind of imitating certain body positions in paintings.
Okay.
And just putting that into the space and how I could make that move.
Yeah.
And especially with this piece, it was very much so, it's very 2D, I think. Because, you know, they were all wearing black, so practically silhouettes against a very white background. So I kind of wanted to play with shapes and lines and just sort of with the silence of kind of just removing everything from that space. But what was interesting was that the silence was really deafening. It was very loud. And that was sort of a really interesting thing to play with. But yeah, it was just generally just imitating paintings and just seeing how I can transpose that into a real space and just see how that will work. I was really inspired by this illustration on this Greek pottery of sort of the first humans that Plato described.
Okay, right.
Where there were these two figures, these black silhouettes kind of conjoined together. And that was sort of another influential point, I think, for that piece of just having these bodies merge and coming out, sometimes not knowing whose joint is who.
Right.
And I thought that was really interesting to play with. And yeah, that was it really.
And how did you decide on the use of rhythm and time? Because that plays a very important element, I should say, within that. And did you have a go at playing around, like speeding up, like slowing down? How did you make those sort of choices?
It was, I think, going through it over and over and just to seeing which moments could be held as an image and which images that can be broken.
Yeah.
But it was really hard to find that rhythm.
Yeah.
Because there was no text, there was no music, and trying to figure out a way of keeping the spectator engaged.
Yeah.
Because to be honest, all it really was, when you think about it, you're just watching 6 people bashing themselves against the wall for 25 minutes. And I had that in my mind. I'm like, okay, I know that's like a horrible thing to say to myself, but how can I kind of break that down and figure out the rhythm. And so what we did was, just finding different ways of holding and releasing and finding moments where they would abruptly come out very close to the audience, and just going to different points in the space and repeating certain gestures and actions and just kind of playing with that. But I think it's just luck.
Right.
I think it was because because they did 3 performances back to back.
Right.
And I would say each performance had a different rhythm to it.
Yeah.
So whatever the audience then that captured would have had a different experience of rhythm.
Right. Yeah. It definitely has a very like live element to it, like seeing like live music. Whereas if you see theatre, yes, there's very small nuances, but essentially it's on rails. Like you're not like if you see a matinee, it's going to be pretty similar to the matinee you saw the day before. But I guess with this sort of thing, there's more chance for randomness within it. Just very quickly, in terms of like, if you're taking the same idea in a more traditional theatre sort of sense, dialogue-based sort of storytelling approach, how do you think that would have limited your voice and your vision? Like, so essentially what I'm asking is if you'd explored this in a more traditional theatre format, like you'd actually written dialogue and that sort of stuff, how do you think that would have limited you?
I think it would have been a completely different piece. And that's a difficult one. What would it have been? What would be the limitations? I think I would have had to considered the ways in which what the others would do if one person or two people were speaking. Yeah. And what would the others be doing? So I think I would have had to consider their positioning, but also kind of if it is going to be a traditional version of it, I'd had to consider character building as well. Yeah,
motivation. It would essentially be problem solving. You'd have to justify why people were trying to go through an immovable like brick wall. And then you got the suspension of disbelief of like, why would 6 random strangers try and run at a wall?
Push against a wall. But I think in that sense, it would have been a very absurdist text. Which I'm not. Yeah, I'm very open to seeing how that works. But it's probably something that I won't do for a long time. I'm not saying that I won't use text ever. I kind of am in a new project that I'm working on.
Right.
But it's only like a monologue for one scene and that's it. But I'm definitely willing to explore text a bit more in the future.
And just also quickly again, can we just jump into Romeo Casalucci, the theatre director, artist and designer, because I understand he had a big influence in your practice and work. So could you maybe perhaps give me a direct example, unconscious or unconsciously, of how Romeo inspired some of the creative choices in If I Ever Get Around to Living?
I think it's his use of composition, but also being comfortable in sort of manipulating time.
Right.
Like he's very aware how time can be used and silence can be used as a very powerful tool to kind of emphasize a certain idea or theme.
Yeah.
Because a lot of his works, there isn't any text at all. And then when you're watching some of these performances, you think, how did he get away with doing that? And actually people coming to pay and watch. Because some of the performances you think, really? Because there was what was it? There was a performance that he did in France with his previous company where it was just these containers just kind of dropping sand.
Okay.
There was like loads of them for like 40 minutes.
Yeah.
Whilst the classical musical composition was playing. And that was it.
Okay.
So I think I was very inspired by his sense of like, it's like, I'm going to do this.
Yeah.
And you're going to watch it.
Okay. Yeah.
So I like that. Not arrogance, but like that. I don't know. How would you?
Bravado, I'd say.
Bravado.
Yeah.
Like statement.
The statement, yeah.
It's like, I don't want to just show you something that you're used to. Or
Yeah, and it's like a thing of like he's in opposition of the audience, because a lot of time if you're talking about mainstream media, it's sort of catering to the audience, it's inviting the audience in, whereas this is actively pushing the audience away in a sense of you having a very visceral reaction of like, oh, you can watch this, but I'm not inviting you to actually watch this. You're gonna, it is weird like how things invite you and then push you, and I think both are valid, I think.
But definitely I do agree with him that he really emphasizes the relationship with the audience. He loves spectatorship. Like he prides a lot in kind of involving them.
Yeah.
And I remember he said that if there weren't any audience members to watch a show, all it is just bodies and lights, and that's it. There'd be nothing. So the audience is just as important to the performance itself. And yeah, it's really interesting. I'm still learning about him a lot.
Right.
There's so much to learn about Castellucci, because you watch his performances and it's really hard to intellectualize some things. But the way he is able to write books and essays about this one specific scene, and justifying every single action that he's done for something that's just so absurd and very simple, he's a really intelligent man.
And did you get a chance to speak to any of the audience members afterwards, and did they come up with any sort of questions or thoughts that were kind of surprising at all?
One of the audience members had to leave as soon as it finished, and they started to cry.
Okay.
And there was a lot of people crying.
Okay.
I'm not like, I wasn't like happy from a place of schadenfreude, you know, I wasn't like, aha, I made you cry.
Yeah, I got you, yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
It was just the way in which how the piece resonated with them. That was a very common sort of feedback, that somehow what they saw in those images of these people trying to push against the wall was very personal to them.
Yeah.
And it kind of connected to a specific moment in their life where they felt like they were trapped, or they felt like they were just bashing themselves against the wall.
Yeah.
And then trying to find that resolution of leaving, but also kind of trying to acknowledge that a resolution is not always a resolution. There is another exposition.
Yeah.
And that kind of was a point that I was trying to make in that performance, where everyone had left the space, but only one person remained, and he kept on pushing against the wall. And that's sort of like a motif that I like to play a lot with my projects, where I like to show you that there's a sense of hope to certain things, but the reality of it is that we're just preparing ourselves for the next hill. Yeah. And we're just going to repeat the same thing over and over and over and over. It sounds depressing, but I think we do find those moments of joy and hope, and I think that's what I want to emphasize as well.
And just looking back on that project, what was the biggest thing that you learned from that, and how are you carrying that forward in your creative practice?
I would say don't over-prepare, because that's something that I did for my second final grad piece, which was in a much bigger theatre. I had planned this thing for like a year, and the process was much more rigid. And I think I realized that I need to find a balance between this sense of like trusting my instincts and that essence of just being like, let me just try this and see what happens. But at the same time, it's a very scary way of working.
Yeah.
Because throughout that whole process with If I Ever Get Around to Living, I just didn't know what I was doing was good or bad at all. So I didn't realize what I was really doing or how it felt until the end.
Yeah.
When I heard people give me back feedback, and I was like, okay. So that's what I was looking for.
Right. Yeah.
That's the feedback that I wanted, because I didn't know, but it's definitely worth the gamble.
Yeah.
And I want to continue working that way of not over preparing, being more playful, and just seeing what happens in the room. I think that's the best way to work, I think, for me.
So moving on to topic 4, thoughts for 2023, because we are in the first Monday, 2nd of Jan, as we're recording this. So very new year. Very new year. So how would you energize the next generation, Gen Alpha, I should say? We're past Gen Z, so we've now gone back to the first Roman numeral of the alphabet, to attend theatre, opera and dance recitals, and can they still purely be sold as an analog experience?
Generation Alpha.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm assuming you're Gen Z, so after Z has to start right back.
So have we gone through the whole thing?
Yeah, we have. Yeah.
Wow.
I believe so. Yeah.
Okay, let me answer your question. I got really carried away. I was like, we've started from A again?
Yeah.
How do we engage Alpha?
Yeah.
I think we need to be more inclusive in platforming younger people in the creative arts and giving them more opportunity. But at the same time, it's very scary because there's a lot of budget cuts for creative education. And I worry that they're just creating a generation of very lost and frustrated young people that can't find an outlook. And I feel very scared for them, I think. But of course, with the arts, you know, it is kind of generally targeted towards a specific audience.
Yeah.
So, but then with TikTok, there's been a lot of surgence of kind of like people going to the opera, young people going to the opera, going to performances, going to see like their friends' performances or whatever.
Yeah.
And that's kind of brought in a new generation of audience. So hopefully in that sense, we can still engage with them, but also for them to come to see it live, because I think that's one of the most important things. Yes, online theatre or online performances has been a very inclusive thing because not a lot of people can go to the theatre. Not a lot of people can go to concerts, and because it's expensive as well. But at the same time, if there is a way in which we can engage them live, I think that would be something to achieve. And for me as well, I think just to kind of, if I get to a point where I can give back, I will definitely do it because I know what I felt like when I first started out. Well, I'm still starting out.
Do you think, because I think about it, because, you know, you think about like Shakespeare, you think about opera, like dance recitals from all over the world, and you think, oh God, like, it feels so old. And a lot of these texts and things are like really old, like hundreds of years old or whatever. But there is something inherently cool about seeing, as you just mentioned, like a friend like perform, or just going to see like a performance of something, and that we oftentimes like diminish something due to its sort of like age, but can still seem like very like relevant like now. But I just think there's like a lot of baggage. And also the thing that sort of sprung into mind is like, is Gen Alpha going to mind that there's no like chat next to like the performance, like scrolling up with like emojis and stuff. It's sort of stuff like that I sort of like think about. But then maybe I think that's maybe a preoccupation with like people who get old or older. They're like, oh, well, these young whippersnappers won't appreciate it the way that I did. But when I was like younger, there's sort of old stuff that I really appreciated, that resonated with me, that spoke to me. I guess the main point is just, how do you keep these things alive, like the opera, like the theatre? Because essentially they are can be very niche unless you're seeing like some Harry Potter play. Yeah, exactly. It is trying to get to them. And just sort of referring back to the thing that you spoke about when we were speaking earlier before the podcast about reinterpreting the Carol Churchill play. I think there's got to be this malleability, this be able to sort of remix stuff very quickly for people that have got a short attention spans. I don't believe is like the right word, but you're dealing with a generation that can process information very, very quickly, and they get bored very, very quickly. So I think maybe the answer is with this sort of stuff is just, you, like with anything, you have to just generate content very, very like quickly that can still be based on like the classics, but it's just got to go like a lot like harder. But then maybe that's sort of missing the point. I don't know.
It's a tough one because I feel like at the same time, some of these big institutions still hold on to the glory days. And I think they still try and emphasize that through their programming. And to be honest, that is not really attractive for young people. So I think if we can find a way of kind of breaking that stigma and that bourgeoisness of arts, I think there'll be a much more hopeful outcome for young people.
So if you could change one thing, well, no, actually, that's not correct. If you could make one thing, that's anything, 10% better in 2023, what would it be and why?
10%.
Yeah, just 10%.
Like for me, or like.
Oh, well, it could be for you, anything, because I think like 10% you could actually do. If you're trying to make something 100% better, I think that's impossible. But 10% is manageable. So anything doesn't have to be art related, but anything 10% better could be for you, or could be for anyone.
See, now I'm like conflicted because I'm just thinking.
Okay, let's just go for you. Let's
okay.
Yeah.
Because now I'm thinking, society.
Yeah, this is just because. Yeah, we'll just
10% for me, I think. Being able to find more platforms to create the work from my practice, because I have been very fortunate that I've been able to network and find work related to movement direction.
Yeah.
And the year before, the lighting design and so on. But I think for me, it'd be great if I can improve that exposure of what I do.
Yeah.
As my own practice on different stages. But luckily, I am doing a festival this July in Slovenia to present a piece of work. So hopefully I can bring that back to London.
Yeah.
And present something here. I'm not sure. I've contacted some theatres.
Yeah.
They haven't got back to me.
Yeah.
Usual. But I'm just going to keep pushing that and just see if I can find a venue where they would be happy to produce something like that.
I can put you in contact with Hyphy Studios because they also do art space, but also do performative stuff. In fact, I think they've got like a theatre group that works out a shop in like Margate or something that. Yeah. So I interviewed Camilla, who is the head of that particular charity. So I can link you up with that because that's precisely what they do.
Please, anything.
Yeah. Okay. So just following on from that question, what's the one thing that you're going to start doing in 2023, and what's the one thing you're going to stop doing in 2023?
New year, new me. What would I like to do? I think take care of my physical well-being.
Okay,
a
good.
Bit more.
Yeah.
I think I could do a bit more exercise. Feeling a bit stiff recently. I think if I can keep that consistent.
Yeah.
Which I need to actually. But I think one thing I'd like to get rid of, I probably think doubting myself.
Okay.
I think, because it's just getting to a point where I'm just annoyed by it. I'm just like, really? Like, why are you doubting that, man? You just started something. You've just come up with this idea.
Yeah.
Like, why do you immediately think, oh, that can't be possible because of that, or health and safety, or that'll cost a lot of money. Just like, well, let me just try it, man. So I do feel like I have that internal dialogue.
Yeah.
With that part of myself where I'm always kind of arguing. And even that in itself is frustrating. Because then you're just in this fight or flight mode constantly. And I'd like to be able to kind of challenge that a bit more and just try and just follow my instinct and just see what happens.
Okay. So as a young British creative in London faced with a Tory government, which has just defunded the English National Opera, do you feel optimistic about being able to continue your practice over the next couple of years?
Yes and no.
Okay.
I think I kind of said to you earlier before the podcast talking about how things are becoming more restrictive in terms of content. If it keeps going that way, I'm very concerned about what I can do. I think I could definitely still work in theatre and hopefully work with really brilliant people in different theatres. That's fine. But in terms of my practice, I'd be very concerned about, because of the restrictions, I'd probably have to take it elsewhere, go somewhere else, which is Europe. Even though they have their issues as well. That's something I realized a few years ago, where I kind of idolized Europe for their culture and the arts and the theatre. Yeah. Even though they're just probably going through the same situation as us. But I think there's certain places where that restriction is a little bit more loose, like Germany, for example. Yeah. So, and I don't really want to do that. I'd really want to make some sort of change and make some sort of exposure of this type of work in this country. Yeah. But we'll see. I mean, we'll see how it goes in the next few years. And the thing about mentioning about the English National Opera is the fact that the reason why they defunded it is because they didn't want London just to purely be the centre of like culture in terms of getting the most amount of money, that they were taking that money and then giving it to places like up north, which I'm like,
Okay, I get
Yeah.
the fact that you need to sort of share the wealth, and we need to have more sort of like cultural hubs. Which leads me on to my question: was like, would you consider yourself to be a more like London centric artist, or would you be willing or to like relocate somewhere else? Say like the north of the country to continue your practice and your work. Is geography or location even an issue for you? You literally just go wherever you're able to put the work on.
I think it just depends on the platform and the access. I think for me, of course, if you're in London, it's much more accessible in terms of going to places. There's loads of places that you can go to.
Yeah.
But then, and there's a lot of places up north as well. But I just don't think there's enough support going into those institutions.
Yeah.
For example, I'd love to present work in Scotland. Like there's a really brilliant theatre called Tramway.
Right.
Really experimental. I didn't know it existed.
Yeah.
And their program is absolutely insane.
Yeah.
So for me, I'd love to take more work up to Scotland.
Yeah.
Up to Glasgow, Edinburgh. Not sure about the Fringe yet, because I feel like I need a bit more money for that.
Yeah. That's definitely a commitment.
I don't think people realize how expensive the Fringe is to even put on a show.
Yeah.
You're probably going to lose more money than you'll gain.
Yeah.
And I think that's another issue that they need to sort out as well.
Yeah.
Because it's not really accessible, the Fringe.
Yeah. Interesting. I guess like it is, and again, we haven't really sort of spoken about this, but there is like an awful lot of like out of pocket expense you have to put in off your own back to work, to make your work. And I guess like if you're making work that isn't necessarily quote unquote, like, as you said, spoke about, you're not putting like a Harry Potter like a play on, there isn't necessarily like the money, but these are the things, the more avant-garde or experimental things that actually enrich our culture and like shift it.
Yeah.
And obviously by saying that, I'm not denigrating Harry Potter. I'm sure in its own special way it's changed culture. But in terms of broadening people's horizons of what's possible, I think that it is important to put money in and show work where you can sit in something, and also being able to give people the possibility to watch something they really, really don't like, because then essentially that tells you what you kind of like do like as well. It's just that opportunity to just show something and engage, and whatever the outcome of that is, I don't know, whatever it is, isn't it?
That's the thing. I think there's too much assumption of what the audience likes. If you just give them a chance of giving them a wide range of things to see, they will come and see it. Because that's the thing, that now they're just assuming what the audience likes and what makes the most money. And there's a lack of an intrinsic value to culture now. Yeah. And it's a really sad thing to see. And the audience is now, I'm not saying every production does that, but I'm just saying in general, we're being spoon-fed content, which is kind of ironic with social media as well. So there needs to be more risk-taking. And just presenting a piece of work and just be like, oh, I've brought this guy or someone, whoever from Europe or wherever, he's going to present the show. And that's the thing, we need more access for new work, international work and experimental work. That's a very key thing.
And finally, what's your dream project if time and money wasn't an issue?
Wow. I haven't decided that. At all yet. I think it just depends on what I'm thinking at the time. I mean, because if I get an opportunity like that, I'd probably try and make the most of it, but probably something, I'd love to try and do like a trilogy again. I'd love to like maybe redo the trilogy that I did, but just completely radically change it, because there's certain aspects of the performances that I'm not really proud of. And that could be better. So I'd love to do some sort of trilogy, maybe readapt, I don't know, Dante's Divine Comedy or something, or Paradise Lost into this crazy, like big visual thing. That would be amazing.
Okay. So lastly, where can people check out your theatre, movement and design work and follow you on social media?
Yes, so you can check me out on Instagram. So that's kxn.nak. Sorry for the weird spelling. And just my website, I think it's www.nakajimak.com, something like that.
I'll put all this stuff below. Basically, the links all in the.
I've just bought a domain, and I'm still kind of trying to remember what it is.
I'll put all that stuff at the end of the episode so people can check all that sort of stuff. And I guess just my final question is, like, sort of a parting thought that you'd like to leave people with today.
Wow.
Yeah, just that can be anything random, just anything sort of springs to mind.
Okay. I don't want to be like, remember my name. But just keep on a lookout. I promise I'll try my best and do what I came here to do.
Brilliant. Okay, well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ken.